Okay, 4 o'clock. I think we can begin. So welcome to everyone. We are Dovetail Learning, and this webinar is Connecting Skills Beyond Brene Brown's Atlas of the Heart. And we're so grateful that you're joining us today.
And just so you know who we are, I'm Chuck Fisher, ED of Dovetail, and Meri.
Meri McCoy Thompson. And I was going to click when I realized you have the clicker.
Okay, you say go, and I will click.
Go. So before we do anything else, I want to appreciate you all for coming and just to thank you for being you. We know you spend your days and sometimes your nights handling all the challenges that come up. We know you spend a lot of time taking care of the people around you. And we want to thank you for caring because we know it makes a difference in the world. Next. And a little bit more about myself. I have 2 adult children and one who's going to be married in April, my daughter. And I've also been caring for my elderly parents. I have to say this is a little poignant slide because it reminds me my stepfather passed away a month ago. So I'm in the middle of grief. As Brene Brown says, it's good to name it. And caring for my mother who has Alzheimer's and our kids. So my goal is really to help empower others to live their best life. I've been working for nonprofits in education and healthcare my whole career. Chuck, next slide.
And my name is Chuck Fisher, and what I love to connect with is the world. Meri's worked all over the world. I grew up in various places around the world, and just made me just have this deep desire for connection to people, places, and things. Committed to creating a world that works for all of us. Here are some pictures of my most important connections. These are some of the kids I grew up with in Peru when I was in elementary school. These are my grandkids who break my heart all the time because I love them so much. And then one more person who's an important connector for me. This is me at 3 years old. And in some ways, this has been the hardest journey to learn how to connect deeply with myself and understand, accept, and have compassion for myself, which is a lot of what this work is about.
Dovetail Learning, our mission is to strengthen resilience in adults, youth, and children. And our vision is to create a world of kind, connected human beings, which is why we love to talk about this work with all of you. Next slide. And I want to say right up front, our work is an open educational resource, which means you can download it and use it for free. We're going to share the slides and the recording with all of you afterwards. You can adapt it for use in your community. As long as you give attribution and share back anything that you create with the work, we'd love it. And also share alike. Anything that you use with our work, share with the same Creative Commons license. Next slide. Our agenda today is really about helping you cultivate meaningful connection skills. Chuck and I are huge fans of Brene's work. We've learned so much from her, and we love the way she shares stories and really helps us all feel connected just through her work. So we'll be acknowledging her wonderful contribution. But we also understand as we go through her work that for me at least, I wanted more when I was going through the work. It's like, it's wonderful, and yet what do I do with it? And we really felt the We Are Resilient approach is a really useful adjunct to her work, can help take it a little bit further. We're going to talk today a little bit about what can get in the way of resilience. That's a bit of a review for those of you who are in our July webinar, but we'll spend most of our time in connecting skills. And we also want to tell you that we want this interactive. If you have questions, please just pop them in the chat or the Q&A. We can't wait to hear from you. We love to talk as we go along. Chuck and I are going to be going back and forth. And also afterwards, we love if you want to send us emails or questions. We just love to connect. That's why we do the work. So thank you. Next slide. So as I said, we're just going to begin with our favorite takeaways from Atlas of the Heart. If you have favorite takeaways, just add them to the chat. I think for me, my favorite takeaway was just the importance of naming emotions. I have to say, after going through the work, and not only are we reading it, we did a book club with it. So we have a lot of discussion around all the emotions. And when I'm feeling something, sometimes I just sort of go through the list and like, which one am I feeling? Really talking about it. And I feel like it's helped me center myself in my emotions better. It's also reinforced how we shape our experience through language. By naming it, then we claim it, as Dan Carnes would say, and we move out into the world with it. So, what about you, Chuck? What do you think your favorite takeaways are from Atlas of the Heart?
Gosh, there's so much. I think the distinctions within any single emotion, that there are sometimes there are names we use for emotions that we think we know we're saying the right emotion, and in fact, the deeper meaning is somewhat different, and it alters the perception of an emotion when we can see what the deeper meaning is. So I'm not thinking of an example right now. All I can think of is the last book club meeting we had where we discussed love for an hour, and what were all the nuances of love and loving, and it really came down to acceptance uh, of another and the situation and ourselves.
Yeah, it's so powerful to spend some time in those distinctions because it just can feel us in ways that I think we didn't really know. Right? And moving beyond saying I'm sad, but like, am I disappointed? Am I discouraged? Am I, what am I exactly? And that helps me move forward into a different place. So, yeah. So for us, the question is now that we can name our emotions, what's next, right? It's really helpful to name those emotions, but we want to lean into Brene's ultimate goal, which is helping us connect, cultivate meaningful connection. And I think that's our ultimate goal as well. I mean, that's what our hearts are wired to do. I love to say we're hardwired for connection. That's one of her words that I've used all the time now. Yeah. So it's really helpful. So
Yep, go
um,
ahead. Mhm.
for Brene, the three ways she talks about cultivating meaningful connection are grounded confidence, the courage to walk alongside, and story stewardship. And we felt like that really those really resonated with us. For us, and We Are Resilient, which is the approach that we developed, grounded confidence was something that we've called centering skills. And we talked about those a lot in our last webinar. And the courage to walk alongside fits more in, and the story stewardship fits more in our connecting skills. And so that's why we decided to have this webinar today to talk, give you more specific skills about what is the courage to walk alongside and story stewardship. What does that feel like? What kind of things do we stumble with, and what kind of things are help us be more successful as we struggle with those things and as we try to embark on those? Chuck, you had some comments?
No, thanks for that great introduction. I think it's a good place to start. And where we want to go is just a very brief overview of what we did last time, these skills for grounded confidence. And in terms of connecting, it's really about connecting to our own resilience. And we have a very simple definition from Ann Maston at the University of Minnesota, that our resilience is connecting to our own superpower. And it's an ordinary superpower. It's the everyday magic of being human. It's the ability to connect to when we get thrown off center, we can bring ourselves back on. And we do that all day long, every day, sometimes in huge ways, sometimes in minor ways. We get distracted, we bring ourselves back to center. We get emotionally thrown off by something someone says, or we get triggered and we bring ourselves back, or we have a more serious event or circumstances that really we need to work at being centered. And one of the best ways to be centered is to connect, what we call relational resilience. Um,
And
so
I think One of the important things for me in terms of resilience is just understanding we can strengthen it. We already have it, but we can strengthen it with specific work, which is why we do the work we do. And it will always go up and down. We're never going to be perfectly resilient. So some days we feel more resilient, and some days we just have to say, I'm not my most resilient self. That can be a useful phrase to pull out when we're not so resilient.
And you know, it's so helpful to say that with another person. You know, we can be in our own worlds of being not so resilient and not sharing that. But on our team, we love to go around the circle and say, well, where are you on a scale of 1 to 10? Well, I'm at a 7 today. Well, I'm only at a 3. And it just brings that human dimension into the room so that we can all know and care about and be supportive in a connecting way with each other. So what gets in the way? This is one of the things we've discovered is one of the most useful frame of references. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it today. For those of you who are in our last webinar, you saw that we spent quite a bit of time on it. Brene Brown calls it armoring up. So let's take a look at how we look at that. We do it through a set of patterns we call protective patterns. This is our reactive resilience. We armor up over the course of our lifetime in order to protect ourselves, our safety, our sense of well-being, our sense of identity. It's really how we react to the world. And these are the protective patterns that we've identified and that we teach, from distrusting to hypervigilance, hyper-caretaking, avoiding, defending, and attacking. If you've been in our webinar, go ahead and chat in something that's been true for you. And I see we've got a couple of questions here. We'll get back to that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for putting your questions in. So this idea of reactive resilience and protective patterns is truly, truly, truly a significant and important part of how we stay resilient, because it helps us stay safe. And each of these reactions, which may sound or look negative, have a very positive intent as well as a positive function. It's really important for me to avoid things so that I can hold my own and stay centered. And I can come back to them later. But if I get hijacked by something that I really need to avoid, that avoiding skill is really useful.
Some of you are noticing the ones that you've been using. Maybe you were in our last webinar and you've been noticing since then, like the protective patterns that you're using, which is such a helpful thing to do. And if you want more information, go to our website and look at we have the past webinars on our website page, and you can look at the past webinar and really learn more about our protective pattern.
Yeah, so a couple of you have put in some questions. This is really a new kind of parenting education, and it's extraordinarily powerful in prevention. We actually have been training pediatricians and clinics and staff for a number of years now in this approach, so that they can bring this to people. We're going to be talking about the connecting technique, which you are calling honest sharing, and we call it being authentic, authentic speaking. So thank you for that. So back to our reactive resilience and the idea of resilience itself. We have these ways in which we, all human beings, lose our cool. We call it noticing our stress reaction. We're going along fine, there's an event, there's a reaction, we call it protective patterns. We get a certain amount of reaction. It might be a huge reaction, might be smaller, and eventually we calm down, and it often causes a depletion. So what we're talking about today are how do we manage our stress curve when the same thing happens. We can notice our protective patterns, really wonder, well, what's going on with me? What reactive patterns are going on? And then choose the resilience skills that help. And today we're going to focus on the centering skills, and really looking forward to this conversation.
The connecting skills, yeah.
Oh, yes, connecting skills. But last time we focused on the centering skills.
So if you want to see these more, go into our previous webinars and you can learn a lot about the centering skills or take some of our other work. But they do give us the grounded confidence that Brene's talks about.
Don't they though? Yes.
Next slide.
So that idea of grounded confidence, if I use any of these skills, like really paying attention and noticing myself, or catching my breath, or letting go of something I'm stuck on, it lets me be present to you, to another, to the situation at hand. As we said, we're not going to go into those today, but we're going to look at, well, what are the skills that help us actually connect? This idea of the courage to walk alongside. Meri?
Yeah, next slide. So these connecting skills give us what we call relational resilience. And that relational resilience is the resilience to handle problems when they come up in a relationship. So we are strong, and it gives us the courage to walk alongside people. And it's as Brene said, we're hardwired for connection. So strengthening our relational resilience can be something that really gives us a deep satisfaction. Next slide. The power of connecting is immense. If we're curious about it, how does connecting help us? Well, it helps us, it creates safety, trust, and belonging. We feel safe with one another. We share what's most important to us. We're vulnerable, awkward, brave, and kind, as Brene talks about it. It also enables us to have an open mind and curiosity, because we don't have to be protective around other people, and we can really be wondering. So it really opens us up so much, and it reduces blame, judgment, and bias. So if we're really having an honest connection with someone, we're not putting them in a box, we're not placing them somewhere else. We're in this real open place. We belong with the other person. And it's amazing how, when we're really doing that, even if initially if we find these people very different from us, we can find immense similarities with people when we're really connecting, which encourages equity. So next slide.
Before you go on, Meri, I'm just reflecting on how powerful this really is. We're talking about it in an intellectual manner, but when I've had a hard day, or you and I have a big meeting we're getting ready for, it really is our ability to see each other and be present to what the other person's going through. When you do that for me, it lets me calm down, settle, and feel my own confidence. Connecting.
Absolutely.
And it goes both ways.
That's the virtuous cycle of centering and connecting, which we love. Centering helps our relational resilience. Sometimes if we're not sure, like about someone we're going to have a conversation with, we can center ourselves. It helps us go into that conversation. Sometimes when we're feeling off-centered, like you said, you have a connecting with someone, and then that helps us center. So this virtuous cycle between connecting and centering really can help strengthen us and helps us be the people we want to be.
Just a quick story. I was camping this past weekend over Labor Day with my grandkids, and one of my granddaughters, who's 7, she was having a furious temper tantrum, and she took her bowl and left the picnic table and hid behind a tent, and she was off center, and I was pretty centered, so I picked up my bowl and I walked over and I said, "Hey, can I sit down with you?" And she said, "No, leave me alone." And I said, "Oh, well, I just really love you. I'd just like to sit down, and is that okay?" And she nodded her head like this, and I sat down with her, and within a minute or two, we were just having this wonderful conversation. So my centeredness allowed her to find her own center.
Absolutely. Happens to me all the time. Yeah. Thank you. So we're just going to talk about 5 centering skills today.
Connecting. Those two, yeah.
Next. So we're going to talk about the connecting skills of noticing others, heartfelt listening, empathizing, choosing kindness, and speaking authentically. And next slide.
You want to do the poll now or later?
We're going to do the poll.
Oh, we're going to do that on the next slide.
Yeah, the next slide. That's what I was like.
Sorry.
Okay. So the poll we're asking, and I think Chuck's going to bring it up, is which connecting skill do you use most? Not which connecting skills you're curious about. We know that you already use a lot of these skills just by definition. They're not rocket science. You've used them before. And a lot of our work is about helping you become more aware, just more intentional about using skills you already know. And it's amazing how when you're intentional about things that you know you should do, you can do them better, you can do them more effectively, you can do them more often, and your life improves. So we're not so much teaching you something you've never heard about, but helping you be more intentional about things. And thank you to those who have filled out the poll. We're going to give you like 15 more seconds, and then we'll close it. I think that feels good. Okay.
Yeah, I love these polls. It really gives us a flavor of our human condition and, what do we use? What do we draw on? So thank you, all of you who have participated. I'm going to end the poll, which will share the results. And it's just fascinating. Um,
It's pretty well divided. Noticing others, heartfelt listening, and empathizing are things that people feel like they do already. Choosing kindness, I'm sure that many of you are kind and are kind a lot, but I think being intentional about it is just something that maybe you aren't as intentional about it. And speaking authentically usually is more of a challenge for people because it's difficult. And I will say, just in all of these skills, we actually encourage them to be done in order. So we encourage people to notice others, heartfelt listening, do empathizing, choosing kindness before speaking authentically. And we'll talk more about that, but I think it's one of the reasons it often comes in last because it's hard to do all the things that we need to do so that we're really speaking authentically in the way that's the most helpful and the most encourages connection. So we'll talk about that at the end. Okay, thank you for doing the poll. And next slide. So our first skill here is noticing others. And we have a tagline for all of our skills. This tagline is, noticing you gives me a clue. Noticing you gives me a clue. Next slide. So when we notice others, if we're curious about it, noticing others really involves paying attention to their energy, and what are we noticing about the other person? What are we sensing? What are we feeling about what is happening? Sometimes that's in our body, sometimes it's our gut, sometimes it's things that we see, sometimes it's things that we hear. Just an example, my husband came in today and he was kind of sweaty and disheveled and a little bit, scattered in his eyes. And I'm looking and I'm thinking, this guy needs a nap and he needs to take care of himself before I launch into any of the things that I have on my mind. And if I hadn't noticed that, I could have launched into, well, we need this, that done. And the conversation wouldn't have gone well. So when we're actually noticing about someone, sensing and feeling about them, it makes a big difference in our ability to connect. We have a question here. Two participants raised their hand. If you can just put your question in the chat, that's helpful. Anything you have to say in the chat, it's an easier way for us to engage. So that would be great. Or in the Q&A. So what do we notice first when we encounter others? Chuck, how's that go for you?
Oh, I just always get a sense that I notice someone's emotional energy. It's like someone walks in the room, you're the radar from my being can just pick up, visually, kinesthetically, energetically, whether someone's down or up or just out of sorts or in sorts, just like you were talking about um, with your husband.
Yeah. Yeah. And what about others' way of being influences the most? Your energy, as you talked about, and their mood, right? So people come in cranky, you feel it, right? I have to say, when my daughter was a teenager, 14, 15, she, poor thing, just dealing with life was so much for her that when she came in, it was almost like a dark hole because she didn't know how to deal with things. And so she sucked energy in. And it was just the way her energy was. Now, luckily, it was short term and moved away from it, but it's how we can be sometimes. And it makes a huge difference to a room, to a group of people, to a connection, people's way of being. Right. And which also, of course, flips means what our way of being also influences people. So if we, have things that we're really struggling with when we walk into a room, people are going to feel that. And even if sometimes I try to hide it, um, people can feel it.
Yeah, what I'm thinking about, Mary, is what influences us the most. What influences me are often my own judgments about the way the other person is being. So I gotta get out of my own way instead of being reactive, and I can catch that I'm getting stuck in some way. Then I can shift my own energy and welcome whatever that person is bringing or their way of being.
Yeah.
And that
Renee
helps me.
talks about that as making up stories in our head, right? We've made up a story about how they are, right? So I could have made up a story when my husband walked in today and say, oh, he's upset with me and he doesn't have any energy. And I happen to have talked to him and knew he was in the middle of a long drive. And so it wasn't anything to do with me. But it is easy to have our own judgments get in the way if we're not curious and haven't spent.
The last question is, what gets in the way, and I think we've already talked about that a little bit. Um, Judgments and assumptions, stories, internal stories.
Next slide. So we just, when we encourage people to have micro habits when you're trying to intentionally notice other people. And just think about, what do you feel physically when you notice another person's difficult emotions or attitude? Where in your body do you feel this? And just spend some time noticing that. Again, it just helps you be more intentional about noticing others. And when we can understand other people's emotions, when we can notice at least what they're happening, we have a better time connecting. Next slide.
Thanks, Mary. So this brings us to the next skill, which we call a connecting skill of heartfelt listening. And the tagline for this skill is feeling a part, listen with my heart. So let's just look at that a little more closely. What's going on here when we're curious about it? What does that help us understand or access? How can I listen to truly understand what someone else is trying to communicate instead of staying in my story? And is my heart open to their truth and their way of being, however they are, without being judgmental? So that brings us to sort of this wider question of, well, how do we know when we're listening with our heart or when we're not? What comes up for you with that, Mary?
Well, for me, the interesting thing about this skill is that I always thought I was a good listener, and I am a good listener, but I pay too much attention to people's words, which is interesting and counterintuitive. Honestly, if I pay attention to what people are trying to say beyond their words, underneath their words, and understand a lot of times people don't actually have the right words for what they're saying, I'm so much more successful. And I've stopped trying to rely on what people's words are and trying to listen to what they're saying beyond their words, behind their words, underneath their words. We know we're listening with our hearts when we almost have a resonance in our hearts. There's an energy that happens when we're having a deep connection when someone is saying something important to us. Our bodies connect in a way that not just our minds do. So it's helpful for me to pay
We're,
attention to my, not just what's happening in my words.
We're not going to go into the science of it so much today, but Mary's speaking about something called heart coherence, which is literally the heart is beating as measured by the space between the heartbeats in a coherent manner that allows us to literally have a resonance with the other person's heart space and their state of being, and that's been measured in the laboratory all over the world as a way of we can tell when our heart opens, which for me is what we're talking about when we listen. And if my heart's closed down, I can feel it in me, or I can feel it in my inner dialogue where I'm trying to rehearse what I'm going to say to someone before they're done speaking. And that's all gets in the way of truly listening with the heart, which is what Brene calls the courage to walk alongside someone, to be with them in their story, their space. And we have the micro habits and heartfelt listening about just, wow, can we just put down our devices? Gosh, my sister was visiting this weekend and I couldn't believe how much she was on her iPhone. It was like she totally disconnected from others. So I felt like she wasn't available some of the time for listening. And listening without our canned response, or listening to our own response, or what are we feeling? As Mary was saying, what's the feeling inside? The feeling inside leads us to the next skill, and we're popping along here so that we can move through all of this.
Empathizing. The tagline here is hearts are the prize when we empathize. Next slide. Hearts are the prize when we empathize. And the feeling here is, what does it feel like to be in this person's situation? What must this person be feeling? And so that's really leaning into what are the feelings that are happening here. And then when we are connecting with those feelings, that's when we have hearts are the prize that we must empathize. Next slide, please. So a lot of this, we have three types of empathy, actually. We have this cognitive empathy, which is understanding how others see the world. What must something be feeling? Why might they be feeling it? What happened, right? And that's sort of getting it into our head. And then the next kind of empathy is really heart empathy. And that's a sense of how this person feels. And it's interesting for us. We know that when people are doing difficult work with others, it's actually important to have some boundaries. And Brene Brown talks a lot about those boundaries. But when we can have a sense of how this person feels without actually feeling it ourselves. And that can be actually super helpful. I know I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday, and her mother, she had just lost her husband 6 months ago. We were talking about grief because, as I shared with you, my stepfather had died. And I was having empathy for her, sensing how she was feeling, but I wasn't diving into it myself at that moment. I wasn't feeling the feeling of grief. And that way I could have this walk with her. I could walk alongside. We could talk about grief without me, sort of bawling myself. And having that interesting boundary is complicated and important. And so understanding how we can be empathetic for someone, having a sense of how this person feels, I could say, yes, I felt grief when my stepfather died, without actually moving into it myself in such a deep way. The third type of empathy is compassionate care, right? And it leads us to action and support, and it's very important. Compassionate care can actually be just sort of sending people thoughts and prayers. It's denigrated a lot, but actually having people in our hearts makes a huge difference. But for us, it also is so important. It leads us to the fourth skill, choosing kindness. So actually acting on our empathy is really important. But when we're still spending another minute exploring empathy, on next slide, please. We find empathy really important because I think a lot of us feel like we're empathizers. We empathize with a lot of people, but we also have really run into understanding how we actually have boundaries to our empathizing. And there's a lot of people we actually have trouble empathizing with. And it's one of the things that I enjoy a lot when we're teaching courses in circles. helping people kind of dive into that trouble. You want to talk a little bit about that, Chuck?
Well, it already is pointing the direction here on the slide because in addition to the protective patterns, which we very briefly just covered at the beginning of this webinar, we also look at cultural patterns that are inherited ways of our beliefs, attitudes, behaviors that we've inherited from our family, our culture, our religion, our racial construct, ethnic orientation, all these ways, our religious upbringing, all these things teach us perspectives or lenses through which we look. And for me, a lot of those bring me trouble with my empathizing. I was, brought up in a deeply Republican family, and that shift, influenced how I thought, changed for me over time. I was brought up living in other cultures, so that made me really love other people of all walks and colors and kinds of backgrounds. So those things helped influence my ability to empathize.
And other things, just simple things, can influence our ability to empathize. If someone is hurting someone that we care about, we have trouble empathizing with them, right? And there's just a whole range of things that, and so when we think about empathy and developing our empathy, and I think we're in agreement on how important empathy is if we're going to create the world we need. This connecting skill is critical. And it's important for us to look with, clear eyes about what our issues are around empathizing and what we can do to change that. As we said in the beginning, our vision is a world of kind, connected human beings, which means really leaning into empathy, even when it's challenging for us.
Mary, I think you just came up with a new tagline for empathizing. Uh, Having clear eyes in order to empathize.
Yeah, well,
This wonderful quote here by Maya Angelou. I've learned that people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel.
it's clear. This is a good link to our next skill. Chuck, you want to talk about them? Oh,
I got a couple micro habits first.
yeah, just letting someone know when you feel what another person's emotions are like. Help, when I was talking to this friend's mother, I was talking about, yeah, grief is hard. And we talked about the difficulty of grief. We had that shared connection. And also practicing having empathy for yourself when you're experiencing something difficult. I had a difficult week last week, and I decided just to take it slow and not to try to get so much done because there was a lot going on for me. And
Love that. Empathy for self. Uh,
really,
so important. So that brings us to the next skill, the fourth of five, and this is called choosing kindness. Choosing kindness. The choice is mine to be kind. And so when we lean into that and we think about being curious about kindness and how can I be kind in a certain situation? How might my kindness help? We have a picture of His Holiness the Dalai Lama here because one of my favorite sayings of his is that Buddhism is the religion of kindness. That's all it is. And it reminds me of a story for me when I was a young man. I was an outward bound instructor and I was paired up with a woman who I really did not like. We always did these wilderness courses with a partner. And I just decided I was going to figure out what I liked about her. And by just opening that up to seek, to be curious, to look into who she really was, it brought out my kindness, changed our relationship completely. She turned out to be a fantastic friend. And I made the shift from being judgmental to letting her in. It was my choice.
yeah, it's amazing how powerful that is. We talk here, how is solving problems for others unkind? I just had an experience of this. Someone was talking to me and we were kind of this situation I had, and this person was just telling me all the answers of everything I should do. I'm like, this is so unhelpful. I know they thought they were being helpful, but it's not story stewardship. It's not walking alongside. It's walking alongside, which is harder than it seems. That's what's kind, right? When we believe in another people enough, we believe in other people enough to know that they can actually solve their own problems if we support them, if we walk alongside them, and we carry their stories. We're witness to it.
And we strengthen them by doing that, by walking along with them in their story. I have this great quote here from Brene. This is from her book, Atlas of the Heart. Uh, she says, the near enemy, and a near enemy is something that we do automatically that keeps us from something. The near enemy of walking alongside is controlling the path. Sometimes it can look and feel like someone is with us, but really they're trying to control either us or the outcome.
And I'm just going to admit right up front, I have this issue. It's so easy for me to want to do this. This is why I'm naming it, because I'm trying not to do it. But it's very easy for me to like, oh, well, if you just do X, Y, and Z, your life will be fine. I want to control the outcome for others. So
And I love how this fits into kindness because I do that too, especially with my wife. She's feeling down on something or something's not working. I just want to jump in and solve her problem. And she's just a really good resistor, like, no, don't do that. And it helps me to be kind. I can use our micro practices of letting empathy motivate me because I can see or feel or hear that she's going through something difficult, or my granddaughter is, or my colleague. And it allows me to open my heart and be kind. Um,
yeah, so this last one, remind yourself to be kind before going into a challenging situation. I remember talking to some friends about a really challenging situation, and they were talking about all the problems the other people were causing. And when I kind of helped them remind them, like, well, what if you're kind to the other people? It really did open up a different perspective for them. It's like, oh, I have a new way of thinking about it. Instead of battling with the other people, how can I be kind to the other people and come up with a new solution based on that? So it's very powerful.
so now we're going to do the fifth of the five connecting skills, speaking authentically.
Speaking authentically, when I authentically talk, hearts unlock. Next slide. When I authentically talk, hearts unlock. And if we're curious about that, and what does that really look like and feel like? It's how can I speak my truth in this moment, being open, vulnerable, and kind. And as we talked about before, when you're really speaking authentically, you're noticing others. You have heartfelt listening. You're empathizing with them, and you're choosing kindness. And in all of that, even if you're in the middle of a conflict, even if you're in the middle of a turmoil and some big discussion happens, if you're doing all of those things, you can talk in a way that the other person can hear, and they can talk in a way that you can hear. It's amazing how powerful this is. Lene had mentioned in her question the connecting technique of honest sharing for self-healing trauma. And speaking authentically is a type of honest sharing. Next slide. Basically, what it's not all those things that we, tend to say. It's not needing to be right. Sometimes we so focus on needing to be right that we don't really move into being kind. It's not being passive aggressive, having that you statement, attacking, which I can definitely do for sure. But it really is just connecting with the other people, as I said, using all those other skills. It's speaking your truth, but doing it in a kind way. It might involve apology and forgiveness. It often asks for clarification. When I ask a clarifying question, it helps us move into being collaborative with someone else, right? So we're curious about that. We're curious about the situation, but we're not defending, attacking, or assertive when we're able to put aside our protective hat. And can help us overcome so many things if we're actually speaking authentically.
So when we're not speaking authentically, usually something's at play. It may be a cultural pattern. We have here the protective patterns. distrusting, hypervigilance, hyper caretaking, avoiding, defending, attacking, and how do those things come into play when we don't speak authentically?
And it's
Uh,
what Brene calls armoring up, right? So we kind of feel that, right? And we're not able to actually connect.
mm, yeah, I would say I was armoring up this weekend with my sister. I was hyper caretaking. She was doing some avoiding. I knew some of it was why, because she had lost track of her son who was out on a wilderness trip, and he wasn't showing up, and so she was distracted, and so I was hyper caretaking her, which sort of got in my way. Um,
Yeah. So one other thing, just to answer another question that someone had asked, you talked about parenting education that reaches everyone. That could be an extraordinarily powerful kind of prevention. Yeah, our work is designed to reach everyone. And we believe public health organizations should be developing this new type of education. We think it's beyond parenting. It can help us parent, but it helps us become kind of people that we want to be. It helps us thrive by practicing these skills, by noticing our patterns. It helps us be the kind of people we want to be. It helps us connect with others in a way that we want to connect. And then we talk about our collaborating skills, which we've not talked about in these webinars. But together, when we're collaborating, that's when we create the solutions that we need. That's when we create the solutions our team needs, our organization needs, and our world needs. So we feel like this type of education is definitely prevention, and it's very powerful, and it's used in public health, education, business. We design different types of tracks for every type of person because we think this kind of preventative education is so powerful.
and the research backs all that up. This idea of honest sharing, or what we call speaking authentically, is transformative, changes performance, effectiveness, trust, and commitment. And we know that when someone is authentic in a room, it draws people towards them, authentic with kindness. And again, it's not well, I'm going to be authentically, judgmental of you. Uh, it's being authentic about our own emotions and how I'm being impacted. When you talk that way, it really hurts my feelings and shuts me down. That opens people because they get curious, they naturally get curious.
You remind me of the difference between calling out someone and calling in. So
Mm,
someone could say something that's actually hurtful to me. Maybe it's a microaggression. Maybe it's something that really against my cultural patterns or against what I believe is true. And so people have gotten in the habit of calling out someone, naming all the bad things that people are doing, which doesn't actually lead people into a different way, right?
mm,
When we call people in, when we call them in with kindness, that's when we're um, that's when we're making a difference. And
mm.
so I just invite people to practice calling in rather than calling out. Micro habits can help, taking a deep breath before speaking authentically. We talk about breathing mindfully as one of our centering skills. When something's not working for you, share what and why with strength and kindness. And then noticing what stops you from speaking your truth and setting healthy boundaries. Sometimes it's power. We know that a lot of power dynamics stop us from speaking authentically. And just noticing that, we're not asking you to move in a situation that you're unsafe, but just to notice it and move where you can into situations where you're able to speak authentically.
So that brings us through the connecting skills. Um, and we're just over our 45-minute time slot. We'll take a couple of minutes to go through a couple of closing things. I just wanted to thank you, Linnea, who had typed in the question about honest honest sharing as a specific technique that was developed in Europe. It's not what we're talking about specifically, but because I don't know what that research is, it just felt like an easy slide into what we were talking about. We'll look it up. Thank you so much for that. Um, just to begin to close, thank you all for being here.
And if you
Uh,
have questions, type them in the chat or
type in some chats, the tips that we offer using this approach for cultivating meaningful connection include these things. Noticing, listening, or even listening to myself and the story I'm telling myself, empathizing, using kindness, choosing kindness, and speaking authentically. And these skills sit in our larger set of skills that we teach, the patterns and the skills, two types of patterns which we've mentioned, cultural patterns and protective patterns. And then, as we said last time in this webinar, our first Brene Brown webinar, we focused on the centering skills. Today on the connecting skills. And maybe we'll do another one on the collaborating skills. These all are cultivated using the mindsets. Before see, I'm out of order on my slide. Cultural patterns are how we view the world. Reactive patterns are how we react to the world, and the skills we say are how we create our world. Using the mindsets of curiosity, choice, and courage, which we're not going to go into great detail here, but it is a very significant part of our approach. The mindsets guide us in how to best use the patterns and the skills. And we teach using this approach by being a change agent with ourselves and others, using a method we call practice model coach. We practice these skills ourselves to become better using the micro habits. We model them to help others learn from us because they can then see us and learn from our modeling. And then we coach others using curiosity, compassionate questions, and encouragement. And we have, always the adjustments to make if I'm not being my most resilient self in this moment. What pattern can I honor or resilient skill can I choose? And as Meri talked about earlier, all of our work is open education resource. We have multiple book sets. We have books for practical skills for families, which can be downloaded from our website. We have a workbook of over 80 family activities about these things. We also have a set of books for educators, practical skills for educators, and a student workbook on these skills. And then lastly, we have a book for healthcare providers based in, I'm sorry, I'm losing my track.
okay.
Lastly, thank you again so much for being here. Know that you can go to Dovetail Learning. You can download free digital resources, join a circle or a training or another webinar, purchase some of the materials if you want hard copies, and contact Meri or myself.
So we had one question, and anybody feel free to put any other questions in that you have. The question was, any recommendations on strategies to speak authentically when you're often struggling with that and we're not encouraged to do so growing up? And I think this is why we talk about all of the skills, right? All of the skills, practicing all of the skills together helps us speaking authentically. It's very difficult just to do in and of itself, like, oh, today I'm going to speak authentically. But if we're practicing the centering skills, then we can go into the conversation more centered. And you don't have to practice all of them, but one or two that might help you feel more centered in the conversation. And if we practice the other things, if we practice noticing others, and we practice using kindness, and we practice heartfelt listening, and we practice empathizing, all of those things together then help us speak authentically, right?
Often it's also about courage. So this mindset of courage, which we go into deeply, some of our other trainings and webinars, is about our values, having our values lead us. Courage comes from the root word core, which means heart. It's about speaking from the heart. So we've got listening from the heart, speaking from the heart, what matters most, so that we can have the courage to step forward and say the difficult thing or start a difficult conversation.
And also doing it with baby steps. not expecting like, okay, today, I've taken this course, I'm going to run out and do speaking authentically, but understanding that it takes some time. I feel like practicing this approach over several years, I've gotten a lot better. Do I have a long way to go? Yes. But I would say my speaking authentically is much stronger now. And I think that's for all of us who are teaching in the approach. So give yourself time, work on all those skills together, and join one of our circles, because our circles give you an opportunity to practice things over time.
Thank you all so much for being here. We love that you're in the conversation with us. We love sharing our work. Please take us up on the offer to download any of our material for free and sign up for another webinar. And have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
And Linnea, thanks for sharing that, honestsharing.org, which is also a free resource for everybody.